My name is Aaron Tocknell, and I teach at the McCallie School in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is an all-boys boarding and day school. And
I'm Linda Mines, and I'm at Girls Preparatory School in Chattanooga, which is an all-girls day school, grades 6 through 12, about 700 students.
So to start off our talk on what we've done with the collaboration grant, I wanted to tell a quick little story about the spirit of collaboration, which is that the story of how I became a part of this. There's actually 3 or 4 teachers that are a part of this, and the way that I came into this is just this really great just vision or idea of how what happens when teachers really get to collaborate. And so I was working with some students who were doing a creative writing service program, basically. And the interesting thing about McCallie and where it's located is, Chattanooga is very segmented with its geography. You've got lots of ridges and mountains, and then you have the valley. And the valley, for the most part, is now communities in transition or communities in need or low-income communities. And McCallie, where we are on the ridge, you can actually look out, and so literally all that you can see from McCallie is a neighborhood that, with a lot of people who need some services, basically. You call an underserved community. So my students were going out to one of the elementary schools and doing creative writing classes there. But something that I noticed, which shouldn't have surprised me, but did, was I came to the realization that, wow, teenagers are not grown-ups. And, I've read, so, I am a grown-up, and so I've read a lot of Jonathan Kozol, and I went to college and, took some sociology courses, and I know what's going on, and I went to public schools. But the boys really didn't know anything about what they were seeing in the school, and they were surprised by things like, things that, you just sort of just face-palming, like that the teachers cared about the students at this school, and that the students had computers, just things that just surprised them about what they were seeing in that public school. And then they didn't understand why there were still problems if they could see these things. And so that gave me this idea that we should probably have a class or something that helps students to understand these deeper issues beneath the symptoms that you see. So I went down to Sumner McCallie and said, hey, we should have this class. And he said, that's really funny because actually I just wrote a grant for a very similar class. And so then that is where on the McCallie side, consequential philanthropy, where I got to start to be involved in it. And that's, yeah.
And it's sort of interesting because one of the things, GPS and McCallie were founded by the same families. McCallie a little bit earlier, GPS in 1906. Sumner McCallie, who was at the McCallie School, and I had served together for years on the Habitat for Humanity board in Chattanooga and had been working with student projects. In the last year or so, GPS had been partnering with an elementary school in Chattanooga that sort of reflects what you see happening in the Southeast. That school had gone from being 100% Caucasian over the years to being about 90% African American to now 78% Hispanic, about 21% African American, and 1% Caucasian. Incredible school, but the same sorts of things that my students were encountering, and that was, this is a wonderful school. These are the most dedicated teachers that we see. What is it that the school needs to be able to be even more successful? And they're a successful school, but they are really, really having to work hard because of all the requirements from the state system. Well, GPS and McCallie share a common mission statement that says, in one way or the other with both schools, active participating citizens who will be engaged in their community. And that's what really sort of led to the collaboration in writing this grant. When Sumner and I first began talking about it, Aaron joined, and then another teacher from GPS joined, and that's, we have students, just like I'm sure you do at your schools, who have community service has been a part of their existence since they were kindergartners. They love to get out and serve, they love to see those connections, but what we realized was so often they don't understand exactly what it takes to run a nonprofit. How do you make a difference? You can't just have this idea today and implement it tomorrow. There actually has to be funding, there's board training, all of that. So our collaborative grant was a way to get students, 33 of them, voluntarily 2 days a week, 2.5 hours a day, out into the community, working with different nonprofit agencies, working to find out how do you identify problems how do you address those problems, and then how do you make all of that come together? So that's where we began. And that's who we are. I'm a history teacher, and Erin is a writer par excellence and does all sorts of great things. Summer is an academic dean, and this Trish King just came to GPS from the Randolph School in Huntsville, where she was really actively involved in community service. So we're just taking community service and the wonderful grant that we were able to get, kind of spinning it a little bit and getting the kids on the ground making decisions. And the very first thing we did is our first session, the first week we met actually in the mayor's office in Chattanooga, taking a look at Chattanooga demographics. What's the need? Where are the poverty levels? Where are the communities? And what we found is whether it was McCallie or GPS, boarding and day school, most of our students drive a very specific route back and forth to school, and they really didn't know where those communities of need were, because that wasn't where they were living. And while they were aware of certain issues nationally or even regionally, often their idea of doing work was to take a trip and go someplace else instead of doing what needed to be done at home.
So we decided you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. So we had some sessions too. This was a really interesting one. We just had them look at that. That's the valley for the most part, the valley neighborhoods, and we gave them a blank map and the names of all the neighborhoods and asked them to fill it in. How well do you know your city? And they were fairly horrified at how poorly they knew their city. It was a real wake-up call for them.
I do remember one student saying, "So how did I not know this?" And that's what we ask ourselves lots of times as teachers is, how did I not know they didn't know this? Where would they have learned this? And the reality is, I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, we have to build it in.
That's the neat thing with this course is we teach them where they are. I think that's something that so often gets overlooked. And so our first session, we're not going to go. We've done a lot of sessions. Don't worry, each slide is not going to be every single session. But once we did. So Linda has this passion for history, and I, although I'm an English teacher, have this sort of inadvertent passion for city planning because both my parents were planners, and we just sat around dinner at night and talked about zoning ordinances and stuff like that. So I kind of either had to like it or go crazy. So the very first thing that I wanted to teach them after we learned about history was a city is a text. And when you look at if everything in a city is intentional, which it is, grocery stores don't just grow in a certain area, right? Someone put it there. So if everything's intentional, what are those intentions? So we had a session where first I told them what city planning is because they don't know, and then they actually planned their ideal city. And then we actually took it to an organization called the Chattanooga Neighborhood Enterprise and had a meeting with a bunch of planners, and they presented their planned city to these professional planners. And so that was a great week. That was, I guess, our second week of the program, and that got us started. The history, and then what do you see when you look at our town?
And for them, it was interesting to think about the fact that if you were creating a new model city, you could sort of begin from ground up, but that's not how most of our cities and our towns have occurred. They have occurred through history based on what was going on in the region. Chattanooga historically was a foundry town, heavy industry. Well, we're not a foundry industry town anymore. So how do you make that transition, make it smoothly, and allow families to still be intact, have the services they need? And then, of course, part of the rude awakening for the students was, so how do you pay for all of that? Yeah. Where does that money come from?
So our next session was affordable housing, and that was a combination of explaining to them, once again, every Tuesday is, what do adults sort of know or just and that you don't know because you're a young person. And so once we got into the city as a text, we also got into, well, how do you buy a house? So they spent a day on realtor.com with a set income. They drew their income out of a hat. And then they had to find out where could they live in Chattanooga with that income. Could they even buy a house? And one thing that came out of that was this understanding of choice. So there was one group and they were done really early, because their income was, I think, $20,000 a year, and they found one place in all of Chattanooga that they could live in. And then the the higher income kids, the ones that had drawn, $200,000 out of the hat, were wondering if they wanted a built-in fireplace inside the house or one out on the patio. So it was a very interesting exercise for them. And then the next day we went to Habitat for Humanity. That was our trip out to the nonprofit.
And one of the things that they didn't realize was, one, that Habitat doesn't give homes away, but two, the wonderful advantage is no down payment beyond just your sweat equity and initial closing costs, which is very limited because Habitat partners with you. So then we had to back up and say, okay, let's take this income level that you had. How long would it take you to save for the down payment while at the same time you're paying to live where you are? And quite frankly, maybe until they get to be this age, they shouldn't have to think about those sorts of things. But then you begin to realize really how limited the options are for someone who's working full time but not able to save enough to turn on the water, turn on the lights, make the down payment, do the closing costs. And all of that sort of, I think, really gave them a setback to think about. So now there's another level of learning and understanding and connectivity that's occurring.
This was another interesting day. We went out to Volunteers in Medicine, which I didn't know about. And I think that's the other thing that I wanted to bring in and make a point, was that there are a lot of things that we do know, but then there's a lot going on in all of our communities. There's a lot of people doing work for good that we're busy and we don't even know that it's happening necessarily. And so this is basically a free clinic run by churches fund it, and often it's retired physicians come in and do the work. But it is a quote real doctor's office. They keep files. They maintain someone's medical care for as long as they need it, and it's called Volunteers in Medicine. So we took the students there, and the director and a couple of the nurses talked to them. And the thing that struck me about this was that you see them sitting there. They sat there for 2 hours. Our students sat there and listened for the most part. A couple smartphones came out, but not very many. I mean, they really did listen. And that, to me, as a teacher who's always has a 45-minute block to try to keep everyone going, was fascinating to me that they could really focus in on this.
There's something about personal stories. The stories always connect, and when you can talk about a particular client who came in. Okay.
All right, so now we're just going to move on to, we have just some of the reactions that we've gotten from the students. Yeah.
That last statement was one that we wanted our students to understand. And we both are schools that have large financial aid populations, so it's not as though every student that we serve comes from an affluent family. But with knowledge and with experience comes the ability to impact policy and create change, and that's what we wanted them to be aware of. And that's probably what we are most grateful to the grant program for, because the money from the grant didn't go to create the class, it didn't go to pay the instructors, it will go for our final solution, which is for them to decide how they want to spend their money creating change in a agency or in several agencies. So it allows them to be philanthropic in their own situation, but to really tie it to what they've learned now and to watch them struggle as they're thinking through this.
Yeah, that's the last thing that I always want to say is that we asked the students, we took a second and just asked them to reflect, and I had the record button on my phone going. And it was interesting, this sort of mix between hope and despair is a bit of a strong word, but just being overwhelmed by it. So we have 2 weeks left in the course. It's a trimester course, and so for the next several weeks, we've done education and youth at risk, but now we're getting into the economics of philanthropy. We do have this resource thanks to SAIS. They have it's $5,000 that they're going to distribute. And so we get to start talking now about solutions and what that looks like.
And part of the exciting thing about that, and then we'll sit down, is we spent this last week taking a look and worked them through a model where they had to, out of 25 basically values that they were given cards, they had to choose what are the 5 values that are most significant to you, which are the 3 that are least significant. How do you structure your philanthropy based on what you value most? You know, I may be interested in affordable housing, education for pre-K, preschool education. Someone else may be interested in veterans programs. Someone else is interested in something different. We all wish we were wealthy enough to give to everything. How do you choose where you can have the greatest impact with what gifts you've been given? And fun's probably a really sadistic word to use, but it's interesting to watch them struggle, trying even to decide which is more important to me, justice, choice, all those sorts of things, because all of them are important. And that's what we keep telling them. There are so many good things, good agencies in the world. How do you decide where you can have the greatest impact? And we're hoping that will be a lifelong learning.
Thank you.
Thank you.